HOA dumped snow on my property all winter, so I turned it into a wall blocking their street. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Take a moment to leave the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and reading where everyone is tuning in from. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you what happened, because this all began with a single pile of snow that never should have been dumped on my property. The first load of snow they dumped on my property looked like an accident. The 20th one looked like a confession. My name is Ethan Carter, and until last winter, I believed that common sense could solve almost any disagreement between neighbors. I had spent my entire career as a civil engineer, designing roads, drainage systems, and public infrastructure across northern Colorado. I understood how snow moved, where meltwater traveled, and how a few careless decisions during winter could create expensive problems months later. That's one of the reasons I bought my corner property just outside the Maple Ridge neighborhood. It wasn't inside the HOA, and that wasn't an accident. The previous owner had warned me that the Homeowners Association liked to stretch its authority well beyond the subdivision entrance, but I wasn't interested in neighborhood politics. I wanted peace, a detached workshop, and enough land to restore my late father's old pickup truck without someone measuring the height of my grass every Saturday morning. For almost 2 years, that's exactly what I had. My closest neighbors waved when they walked their dogs. The mail carrier always joked about my collection of vintage road signs, and winter usually arrived quietly. Then came the first major snowstorm in early December. Around 6:30 in the morning, I woke to the low growl of diesel engines outside my bedroom window. At first, I assumed the city snowplows were clearing the county road like they always did. But when I pulled back the curtains, I watched a private plow truck with the HOA logo reverse directly onto the edge of my property. The driver raised the blade, dumped an enormous pile of snow onto my front field, and drove away without stopping. I stood there for several seconds, convinced he had simply made a mistake. It was inconvenient, but not worth getting upset over. Snow melts. Mistakes happen. I grabbed my coat, walked outside, and looked at the mound sitting entirely on my land. Tire tracks told me everything. Whoever had done this hadn't wandered off course. They had driven there intentionally. Before I could even finish taking a few photos with my phone, another pickup rolled past, slowing just enough for the driver to glance at the pile before continuing toward the subdivision entrance. That afternoon, I called the HOA office, even though I wasn't a member. The receptionist sounded polite enough and promised someone would look into it. 2 days later, I received a brief email saying the matter had been reviewed and that any snow storage had been performed according to operational needs. Operational needs. I read that sentence 3 times. According to whose operational needs? Certainly not mine. A week later, another storm rolled through. This time I heard the trucks before sunrise. I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee still warming my hands and watched the exact same plow back onto my property again. More snow. Higher pile. Same routine. The driver never looked at my house. It was as if my land had quietly become part of their winter maintenance plan. That's when I noticed someone standing farther down the street, watching the operation from the sidewalk with her arms folded. Even from a distance, Brenda Holloway was impossible to mistake. As president of the Maple Ridge HOA, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every decision she made automatically became the right one. When our eyes met, she offered a polite smile, gave a small wave, and turned back toward the subdivision without saying a single word. Something about that smile stayed with me much longer than the snow itself. Most people apologize when they realize they've inconvenienced someone. Brenda looked satisfied. Over the following weeks, every storm followed the exact same pattern. The HOA cleared its streets quickly, efficiently, and at my expense. The piles grew taller after every snowfall until sections of my front field disappeared behind walls of packed white snow. Some neighbors quietly admitted they had noticed what was happening, but nobody wanted to challenge the HOA board. I didn't argue. I didn't yell across the street. I didn't post angry messages online. Instead, I did what engineers are trained to do whenever something doesn't make sense. I started observing. I photographed every truck, logged every date and time, measured every new pile, and quietly watched the mountain continue to grow. Because while everyone else saw nothing more than unwanted snow, I was beginning to see something else entirely. I never told anyone about the notebook at first. It was nothing fancy, just a weatherproof field notebook that fit inside my jacket pocket. But every morning after another snowfall, I walked the property with a tape measure, a camera, and a small orange survey flag. I measured the height of every new pile, estimated its width, and marked where it ended. Then I went back inside, downloaded the photographs, and labeled every image with the exact date and time. Some people thought I was being obsessive. My father would have called it preparation. He spent 30 years working for the county highway department, and one lesson stayed with me long after he was gone. He used to say that memories become opinions, but measurements become facts. That sentence echoed in my mind every time another plow rolled across the edge of my property. The strange part was that the drivers never seemed angry. They were simply following instructions. They came in, raised the blade, pushed another mountain of snow onto my land, and left within a minute. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no dramatic argument. Just another white pile becoming part of an even larger one. I decided to learn exactly where those instructions were coming from. One afternoon, I drove past the Maple Ridge Clubhouse and found the weekly board meeting listed on a sign outside. Although I was not a member, the agenda included an open comment period. I introduced myself politely and explained that I wanted to understand why HOA contractors kept using my property as a snow storage site. Brenda smiled the same calm smile I had seen from across the street. She thanked me for attending and assured everyone that the association always acted responsibly. Then she said something that immediately caught my attention. She claimed my property was the most practical temporary storage location because it bordered the subdivision and had plenty of unused open space. Unused. That single word irritated me far more than the snow itself. Land does not lose its owner simply because someone else thinks it looks empty. I asked whether anyone had requested permission. Brenda avoided the question. Instead, she explained that the arrangement benefited the neighborhood by keeping internal roads safer during storms. Several homeowners nodded without looking at me. I realized most of them had probably never questioned where the snow disappeared after the plows cleared their streets. To them, it simply vanished. I thanked the board for their time, left without arguing, and sat in my truck for several minutes thinking about everything I had just heard. On the drive home, I noticed something interesting. Every side street inside Maple Ridge had limited space for snow storage. Decorative landscaping, sidewalks, and narrow medians left very few places where large amounts of snow could legally be piled. My property, however, sat just beyond the entrance like an easy solution. Someone had made a calculation. They decided that inconveniencing one person outside the association was easier than asking hundreds of homeowners to sacrifice a few parking spaces during winter. The next storm arrived 3 days later. This time I was ready before sunrise. I watched from inside the workshop as 2 plow trucks repeated the same routine, one after another, adding several more feet to the growing ridge. Instead of walking outside immediately, I waited until they finished and quietly photographed the tire tracks while they were still fresh. Then I measured the newest edition. The numbers surprised even me. By mid-January, the accumulated snow covered a significant portion of my front field. That afternoon, the temperature dropped below freezing again, and the lower layers became packed almost as hard as concrete. Standing there in the silent winter air, I noticed something else. The pile was no longer settling the way fresh snow normally would. It was becoming dense, stable, and surprisingly uniform because every new load compressed the layers beneath it. Years of engineering experience suddenly connected with what I was seeing in front of me. I remembered projects where temporary snow barriers had been used to redirect drifting across mountain highways. I remembered how compacted snow behaved under sustained freezing temperatures. Most importantly, I remembered the local ordinances I had worked with during municipal construction projects. I went back into the house, pulled an old storage box from my office closet, and found several binders filled with engineering references and county regulations. If I was going to solve this problem, emotion would not help me. Complaints had accomplished nothing. Arguments would accomplish even less. The answer, if there was one, would be hidden somewhere inside measurements, property lines, weather patterns, and the same rules everyone else had overlooked. For the first time since the snow started arriving, I stopped seeing those growing white piles as a burden. I began seeing them as raw material waiting for the right plan. I spent the next several evenings surrounded by maps, county ordinances, engineering manuals, and property surveys spread across my dining room table. Outside, another light snowfall covered the existing piles with a fresh layer of powder, making everything appear peaceful again. Anyone driving past would have thought my property looked picturesque. Only I knew that beneath that clean white surface were weeks of compacted snow deliberately pushed there by someone else. The more I researched, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. The county regulations were surprisingly clear about property rights. If snow was intentionally deposited onto private land without permission, responsibility for that material shifted in ways most people never considered. Even more interesting, there was no rule requiring a landowner to remove naturally accumulated or legally stored snow from his own property simply because it created an inconvenience for neighboring parcels, provided it remained entirely within established boundaries and did not interfere with protected easements or emergency access requirements. That last detail made me stop reading. Emergency access requirements. I pulled out a larger survey map of the neighborhood and compared it with satellite images I had saved over the years. Maple Ridge had one primary entrance and one secondary service connection that remained locked except during maintenance work. During heavy storms, nearly all daily traffic relied on the main roadway running along the edge of my property before curving into the subdivision. I was not interested in causing problems for anyone, but I suddenly understood how dependent the entire neighborhood had become on a road they assumed would always remain clear. The following morning, I walked the property again, this time carrying survey stakes instead of orange flags. Every measurement confirmed the same conclusion. The snow never crossed my boundary. The plow operators had actually been careful about that. They simply filled every available foot of my land nearest the road. Standing there in the cold air, I realized something almost made me laugh. They had spent months building exactly what they thought was my problem, while unknowingly providing every piece of material I would ever need. Later that afternoon, my neighbor across the county road, Tom Reynolds, stopped by with a thermos of coffee. He had watched the situation develop from the beginning and quietly asked whether I planned to hire an attorney. I smiled and told him not yet. He looked at the towering snow ridge and shook his head. "I have lived here 20 years, he said. "I have never seen anything like this." Neither had I. We stood there for several minutes watching another HOA pickup drive through the subdivision entrance. It slowed just enough for the driver to glance toward the growing mound before continuing inside. Even the contractors seemed curious about how large it had become. Tom asked whether I thought Brenda would ever admit they had made a mistake. I looked back at the frozen wall stretching across my field. "People rarely admit mistakes while the consequences are still hidden," I answered. "Most only recognize them after those consequences become impossible to ignore." He nodded, although I could tell he did not fully understand what I meant. That evening, I received another email from the HOA office. It politely informed me that additional winter maintenance operations would continue as weather conditions required and thanked nearby property owners for their cooperation during the season. Cooperation. That word stood out almost as much as operational needs had weeks earlier. Nobody had ever asked for my cooperation. They had simply assumed it. I printed the email and placed it beside the growing stack of photographs and measurements. Every document strengthened the timeline. Every snowfall added another piece of evidence. By early February, the weather forecast predicted an extended stretch of freezing temperatures with very little daytime melting. For most homeowners, that forecast meant another difficult month. For me, it confirmed that nature was about to preserve everything exactly as it was. I walked outside just before sunset as the sky turned pale orange over the snow-covered fields. The enormous ridge cast a long shadow across the front of my property, its lower layers now packed so tightly that striking them with the handle of my shovel produced a dull sound closer to solid ice than fresh snow. I ran my gloved hand across the frozen surface and finally allowed myself to think through the idea that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind for weeks. It was ambitious, completely legal as far as my research indicated, and depended entirely on patience instead of confrontation. Brenda believed every truckload dumped onto my land made me weaker. She never considered that every single load was giving me exactly what I needed to solve the problem in a way she would never see coming. The plan only worked if I stayed disciplined. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to confront Brenda one more time, to demand that the trucks stay off my property, to force someone to acknowledge what had been happening all winter. But experience had taught me that people who believe they held unquestioned authority rarely changed their minds because of emotion. They changed when reality left them no comfortable alternatives. So I stopped making phone calls. I stopped sending emails. I even stopped attending the HOA meetings. From the outside, it probably looked as though I had accepted the situation. That assumption turned out to be one of Brenda's biggest mistakes. Instead, every morning before sunrise, I worked quietly on my side of the property. I brought out a compact utility tractor that I normally used for landscaping projects around the workshop. Rather than pushing the snow away, I carefully reshaped only the portions entirely within my property line. I was meticulous about every inch. I checked the survey stakes repeatedly, making certain that nothing crossed onto the county right-of-way or any neighboring parcel. The work was slow because I was not trying to create a random pile. I was building stable, compact layers that would naturally freeze together during the long stretch of below-freezing temperatures. Every pass of the tractor compressed the snow a little more. Whenever the weather warmed slightly during the afternoon, I let the surface soften just enough before the overnight cold turned it into another solid layer. It reminded me of construction work, except my building material happened to be winter itself. After several days, the ridge no longer resembled the uneven piles left by the plow trucks. It had begun taking on clean, deliberate lines that blended into the landscape so naturally that most people driving past probably assumed it had formed that way on its own. One Saturday morning, Tom walked over carrying another cup of coffee and stood silently beside me for nearly a minute before speaking. "You are building something," he finally said. I smiled without taking my eyes off the survey stakes. "I am organizing what someone else delivered." He laughed, although there was still confusion in his expression. "Does Brenda know?" I looked toward the subdivision entrance where another HOA truck had just disappeared behind the trees. Not yet. As the weeks passed, more snowstorms rolled through the county, and with every storm the HOA contractors faithfully continued their routine. They added fresh material exactly where they always had, never realizing they were helping complete a project they had never imagined. Sometimes I watched from inside the workshop through the frosted windows while the diesel engines echoed across the frozen ground. They would dump another load, back away, and leave within moments. After they disappeared, I walked outside, measured the new addition, took my photographs, and carefully incorporated it into the growing structure. It became almost predictable, like following the same set of engineering drawings one step at a time. One afternoon, while I was reviewing county mapping records online, I noticed something else worth documenting. The edge of my property sat several feet higher than the entrance road because of natural grading established decades earlier. That elevation difference had never mattered before, but now it explained why the growing ridge appeared much taller from inside the subdivision than it did from my front porch. Perspective was doing half the work for me. A structure that measured only several feet above my field looked almost imposing from the opposite direction. I took additional photographs from multiple angles and added them to the growing file on my computer. By the middle of February, the ridge had become impossible to ignore. Delivery drivers slowed as they passed. Neighbors walking their dogs occasionally stopped to stare before continuing toward the subdivision. Even the HOA maintenance trucks hesitated for a few extra seconds before making their usual deposit. Still, nobody knocked on my door. Nobody asked what I was doing. They simply assumed everything remained under control because they believed they controlled the situation. One cold evening, I stood outside just after sunset listening to the quiet that follows a fresh snowfall. The wind had disappeared, the air felt perfectly still, and the frozen ridge reflected the pale blue light of the approaching evening. I walked its entire length, checking each survey marker one final time. Every measurement confirmed the same reassuring fact. The structure remained completely inside my property boundaries. It violated no setback, crossed no easement, and interfered with nothing beyond the limits of my own land. For the first time all winter, I allowed myself a small smile. The foundation of the plan was complete. Now all it needed was one more heavy snowfall and the patience to let everyone else discover the consequences of choices they had been making for months. The weather forecast arrived exactly when I hoped it would. A slow-moving winter system was expected to blanket the county with another foot of snow over 2 days, followed by a sharp drop in temperature that would keep everything frozen solid for nearly a week. I studied the forecast beside my growing collection of photographs and survey notes, then looked out the kitchen window toward the ridge stretching across the front of my property. It had become part of the landscape now, almost like a natural embankment, except every layer represented another decision the HOA had made without ever asking permission. Before the first flakes began to fall, I drove into town and picked up a few inexpensive supplies that would not attract attention. Additional survey stakes, reflective markers, heavy-duty gloves, and replacement batteries for my camera. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. I simply wanted every boundary clearly visible and every step carefully documented. If someone questioned what I had done later, I wanted facts waiting long before opinions arrived. The storm started just after sunset. Thick snow drifted quietly beneath the porch light, while the wind carried loose flakes across the frozen field. Around 5 the next morning, the familiar sound of diesel engines rolled through the darkness once again. I watched from inside the workshop as the first HOA plow appeared at the subdivision entrance. Just like every previous storm, the driver backed onto my property, lifted the blade, and released another massive load onto the ridge before driving away. A second truck followed less than 10 minutes later, then a third. By the time the county plows finally cleared the public road, the structure along my property had grown higher than ever before. The remarkable part was how routine it all looked. Nobody appeared rushed. Nobody looked nervous. The drivers carried out their work with the confidence that comes from repeating the same task dozens of times. They believed they were solving a problem. They never considered they might actually be completing someone else's plan. Once the trucks disappeared into the neighborhood, I climbed onto the utility tractor and spent the next several hours doing exactly what I had practiced for weeks. I compressed the newest snow into the existing ridge, carefully maintaining the same gradual slope on my side, while preserving a clean vertical face toward the subdivision entrance. I worked slowly because precision mattered more than speed. Every few minutes I stopped, checked the survey stakes, and confirmed that every inch remained inside my property line. By late afternoon, the temperature had already begun falling. Moisture within the fresh snow started freezing almost immediately, locking another layer into place. The ridge no longer looked temporary. It resembled a carefully formed winter barrier shaped by both weather and patience. That evening Tom stopped by again, this time carrying a weather radio instead of coffee. He stood beside the fence for a long moment before quietly asking, "Do you think they still have not noticed?" I looked toward the entrance where headlights occasionally appeared between the trees before disappearing into the subdivision. "People usually notice what they expect to see," I replied. "Right now they expect to see snow. They are not looking closely enough to see what it has become." He smiled, shaking his head with equal parts amusement and disbelief. "You planned this for months, did not you?" I thought back to the first pile that landed on my property in early December, the unanswered emails, the polite dismissals, and Brenda's calm assurance that everything had been done according to operational needs. "No," I answered honestly. "They planned it for months. I simply decided not to waste what they kept giving me." After Tom left, I made one final walk along the entire length of the ridge beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. The air was so cold that every breath drifted away in thick white clouds. I checked each survey marker with my flashlight, photographed every section from multiple angles, and recorded one last set of measurements in the notebook that had become my constant companion. Everything matched the property survey exactly. Every photograph, every timestamp, every measurement, and every weather report fit together like pieces of a single puzzle. Standing there in the quiet, I realized the difficult part was finally over. There would be no dramatic confrontation from me, no angry speech, and no late-night argument across the street. From this point forward, all I had to do was wait. Winter itself would take care of the rest, and sooner rather than later, the people who had treated my property like their personal dumping ground would wake up to discover that the most inconvenient obstacle they had ever faced had been built almost entirely from the snow they chose to leave behind. 3 days passed without anything unusual happening, and that silence became almost unsettling. The ridge stood exactly where I had shaped it, untouched except for a thin layer of fresh powder sparkling beneath the winter sun. Traffic continued flowing into Maple Ridge every morning. Children waited for school buses at the entrance, and the HOA maintenance trucks came and went as if nothing had changed. Brenda even drove past my house one afternoon in a dark sport utility vehicle. She glanced toward the ridge for only a second before continuing into the neighborhood. If she recognized that it looked different than it had a month earlier, she gave no indication. That told me everything I needed to know. She still believed she was in complete control of the situation. Meanwhile, I focused on documenting every detail with the same discipline that had carried me through my engineering career. I photographed the ridge at sunrise, at noon, and again before sunset, recording how the freezing temperatures continued strengthening the compacted layers. I saved weather reports showing overnight lows well below freezing, along with county notices confirming there had been no thaw significant enough to weaken the structure. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Nature was preserving exactly what had been built. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from a county surveyor named Daniel Morris. His truck pulled into my driveway while I was cleaning snow from the workshop roof. He introduced himself, explained that he was updating roadside reference markers in the area, and politely asked whether he could verify one of the property monuments near my front field. I gladly agreed. As he worked, his attention kept drifting toward the ridge. After finishing his measurements, he smiled and said, "That is one impressive amount of snow." I nodded. It has been accumulating for quite a while. He asked if I had hauled it in myself. I answered honestly, no. It was delivered a little at a time throughout the winter. He raised an eyebrow but did not ask another question. Instead, he checked the survey monument one final time and handed me a copy of the updated reference sketch showing the property boundary. Before leaving, he remarked that my survey stakes were positioned accurately. Those few words meant more to me than he probably realized. Independent confirmation from a county professional strengthened my confidence that every measurement I had made was correct. That evening, I added the updated sketch to my growing file of documentation. By now, the folder on my computer contained hundreds of photographs, weather reports, emails, survey records, and handwritten notes. Looking through them felt almost like watching the entire winter unfold in fast forward. Every decision the HOA had made was preserved in chronological order. Every truckload of snow had quietly created another page in the story. The following morning, the local weather station issued a warning about unusually strong winds expected to arrive overnight. I immediately walked the length of the ridge again, checking for any areas that might drift beyond my property line. Using the tractor, I made several small adjustments entirely on my side, smoothing the surface so loose snow would settle naturally instead of blowing across the county road. It was careful, almost routine work, but it mattered. My goal had never been to create a hazard or inconvenience for passing drivers. The entire point was to remain firmly within both the law and simple common sense. As darkness settled over the property, the wind began to rise. Fine snow swept across the frozen field in long silver ribbons illuminated by the porch light. I stood on the front steps for several minutes listening to the quiet whistle moving through the trees. There was something strangely peaceful about knowing I no longer needed to do anything else. Months earlier, I had felt frustrated and powerless every time another plow crossed onto my land. Now those emotions had disappeared, replaced by patience. Whatever happened next would not be driven by anger. It would simply be the natural result of choices that had already been made. Before going inside for the night, I looked one final time toward the entrance road. The ridge stood firm against the winter sky, its clean lines reflecting the moonlight with an almost sculpted appearance. It was no longer just a pile of snow. It had become undeniable evidence that quiet preparation often carries far more weight than loud confrontation. And somewhere beyond the trees, the people who had built it without realizing it were about to discover exactly what that meant. The phone rang just after 6:30 the next morning, long before I usually expected to hear from anyone. I recognized Tom's number immediately. His voice carried a mixture of surprise and restrained excitement. "You should probably step outside," he said. "The whole neighborhood is awake." I thanked him, pulled on my winter coat, and walked onto the porch. The first thing I noticed was the unusual silence. Normally, weekday mornings were filled with the sounds of garage doors opening, engines starting, and commuters leaving for work. Instead, clusters of people stood near the Maple Ridge entrance, pointing toward the ridge that stretched across the front of my property. Overnight, strong winds had sculpted the compacted snow into an even cleaner, taller formation. Because the ridge sat on the slightly elevated portion of my land, It now appeared much more imposing from the subdivision entrance than it had only a day before. Drivers slowed almost to a stop as they approached, uncertain where the edge of my property ended and the carefully shaped wall of snow began. Within minutes, several HOA maintenance trucks arrived. They parked near the entrance while employees stepped out and quietly studied the scene. Nobody crossed onto my property. Nobody touched the ridge. They simply stood there, talking among themselves while comparing the snow wall to the survey stakes that clearly marked my boundary. About 15 minutes later, Brenda arrived in her familiar sport utility vehicle. She walked toward the edge of my property wearing an expression I had not seen before. It was no longer confidence. It was confusion. She stopped several feet from the nearest survey marker and looked across the entire length of the frozen ridge. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she called my name. I walked down from the porch at an unhurried pace and greeted her politely. She asked when I had built the structure. I answered truthfully. It has been developing all winter. She frowned and replied that it had become far larger than she remembered. I nodded. That tends to happen when more snow keeps getting added every week. She looked toward the maintenance trucks, then back at me. This is creating a problem for the neighborhood. Her words hung in the cold morning air. I almost smiled because they sounded strangely familiar. Weeks earlier, she had explained that using my property benefited the neighborhood. Now, for the first time, she was acknowledging that something on my land affected the community. I calmly asked whether she was referring to the same snow that had been deposited there by HOA contractors throughout the winter. Brenda hesitated before answering. Instead of responding directly, she asked whether I planned to remove it. It is entirely on my property, I replied. Every measurement, every survey stake, and every photograph confirms that. She glanced again at the clearly visible boundary markers. There was nothing she could dispute without contradicting the survey itself. More residents gathered nearby as the conversation continued. Some quietly whispered to one another after recognizing just how much snow had accumulated over the past several months. Others appeared genuinely surprised to learn where all the plowed snow from their streets had been ending up. An older gentleman stepped forward and admitted he had assumed the association was hauling it to a designated storage site outside the neighborhood. Brenda did not answer him either. Instead, she asked whether we could discuss the matter privately. I politely declined. There was nothing personal about the situation. It involved documented maintenance decisions affecting private property. As more people arrived, the atmosphere gradually shifted. The discussion was no longer about a snow ridge. It was about how that ridge had come to exist in the first place. Several homeowners began asking questions I had never needed to ask myself because I already knew the answers. Who approved using private land? Was permission ever requested? Why had the association never informed residents where the snow was being stored? I did not interrupt. I simply stood beside my survey markers while the conversation unfolded on its own. Months earlier, I had tried explaining the problem through emails and polite conversations. Almost nobody had listened. Now the evidence stood in plain sight, visible from every angle. Nobody needed a dramatic speech because the winter itself had become the explanation. As Brenda looked from the ridge to the growing crowd and back again, I realized the balance had quietly shifted. For the first time since the season began, she was no longer directing the conversation. She was trying to catch up with it, and every answer she avoided only encouraged more questions from the very people she had expected to support her without hesitation. By noon, county officials had arrived. Not because someone accused me of doing anything illegal, but because enough questions had been raised that they wanted to understand exactly how the situation had developed. 2 vehicles parked along the public road, and a small group of employees stepped out carrying clipboards, measuring wheels, and cameras. I greeted them politely and offered complete access to my property. I had nothing to hide. One of the officials introduced herself as Laura Bennett from the County Public Works Department. She explained that they had received multiple calls from residents asking whether the large snow formation created any violation of county regulations. I told her I appreciated their willingness to review the facts before reaching conclusions. She smiled and said that facts were exactly what they intended to examine. That was the answer I had been waiting months to hear. I walked Laura and the rest of the team along the survey stakes marking my property line. Every marker remained exactly where it had been when the county surveyor verified them days earlier. I handed her copies of the updated survey sketch, along with photographs documenting the location of every stake before and after each major snowfall. She carefully compared the paperwork with the physical markers, occasionally kneeling to verify measurements herself. After nearly half an hour, she looked up and quietly confirmed that the snow structure remained entirely inside my property boundaries. Several nearby residents overheard her statement, and the conversations around us became noticeably quieter. Brenda stood several yards away, watching without saying a word. Laura then asked a question I had hoped someone would eventually ask. How did this amount of snow end up here? Instead of answering immediately, I opened the weatherproof storage case I had brought from the house. Inside were neatly organized folders arranged by date. I handed her printed photographs showing HOA trucks depositing snow onto my property after each major storm. Every image included the date, time, and weather conditions. Behind those were copies of the emails I had sent requesting the practice stop, along with the responses explaining that the operations had been performed according to neighborhood needs. Finally, I showed her the notebook containing measurements taken throughout the winter. She spent several minutes reviewing everything before passing the documents to another official. Neither of them appeared interested in opinions. They focused entirely on the timeline. One photograph became 2. 2 became 20. 20 became dozens. Each image told exactly the same story from a slightly different day. The pattern was impossible to miss. Laura eventually looked toward the HOA maintenance supervisor and asked whether those vehicles belonged to the association. He quietly acknowledged that they did. She then asked whether permission had been obtained before repeatedly depositing snow onto private property. He hesitated, glanced toward Brenda, and admitted he had simply followed operational instructions provided by the HOA. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The facts were already speaking clearly enough. Over the next hour, the officials compared my documentation with maintenance schedules, weather reports, and publicly available records. Everything aligned. The dates matched the storms. The photographs matched the equipment used during neighborhood snow removal. Even the tire patterns visible in several images corresponded with the maintenance vehicles parked nearby. Tom stood off to one side, occasionally exchanging surprised looks with other neighbors who admitted they had never realized where all of the subdivision's snow had been going. What surprised many of them most was not the ridge itself. It was the amount of planning that had gone into documenting the situation without creating conflict. Laura eventually gathered everyone together and explained her preliminary findings. The snow formation itself did not violate county regulations because it remained entirely within private property boundaries and had not encroached upon public infrastructure or protected easements. However, she stated that repeatedly depositing snow onto private property without authorization raised separate questions that would require additional administrative review. Those words changed the atmosphere immediately. The discussion was no longer centered on something I had built. It had shifted toward decisions the HOA had made throughout the winter. Brenda finally stepped forward and suggested that everyone should simply work together to remove the snow and move on. I answered calmly that I had always been willing to cooperate. All I had ever requested was respect for my property and acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Standing there beside months of carefully collected evidence, I realized I no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. Patience, documentation, and the truth had quietly accomplished what frustration never could. The county review continued over the following 2 weeks, and for the first time since winter began, I was no longer the one answering difficult questions. Every document I had collected was matched against maintenance schedules, contractor logs, weather records, and the HOA's own correspondence. The conclusions were remarkably straightforward. The repeated placement of snow onto my private property had never been authorized by me, and there had been no written agreement allowing the association to use my land as an unofficial storage site. The county instructed the HOA to coordinate the removal of the accumulated snow at its own expense while ensuring that no additional material would ever be deposited on private property without permission. Because the ridge remained entirely within my boundaries until that point, I had violated no county regulation by maintaining it there. The irony was impossible to ignore. The very evidence Brenda had dismissed for months became the evidence that resolved everything. Several days later, a special HOA meeting was announced, and although I still was not a member, many homeowners attended with questions they wanted answered. This time, The conversation sounded very different from the one I had witnessed earlier in the winter. Residents wanted to know why they had never been informed where the snow was being placed. They asked why permission had never been requested from the neighboring landowner. They questioned why simple communication had been replaced by assumptions. I did not attend the meeting because I no longer needed to defend my position. The facts were already part of the official record. Tom stopped by afterward and filled me in. According to him, the board voted to adopt a new winter maintenance policy requiring written approval before using any private property for temporary snow storage, while also establishing additional designated storage areas inside the subdivision. Brenda announced that she would not seek another term as president once the current season ended. Whether that decision came from public pressure or personal reflection did not really matter to me. What mattered was that the neighborhood had finally learned something valuable from the situation. As March slowly arrived, warmer afternoons began softening the upper layers of the ridge. The HOA hired contractors to remove much of the compacted snow exactly as directed, carefully transporting it to approved locations outside the neighborhood. Watching those trucks haul away load after load felt strangely familiar, except this time every trip represented accountability instead of convenience. Nobody crossed my property line without asking. Nobody assumed my land belonged to someone else simply because it appeared empty. One afternoon, Laura from the county stopped by during a routine inspection. She looked across the nearly cleared field and smiled. "You kept excellent records," she said. "Most disputes become arguments because nobody can prove what actually happened." I thanked her and admitted that my father deserved much of the credit. His old lesson about measurements becoming facts had guided every decision I made throughout the winter. She nodded before adding something I have not forgotten since. Patience is usually more persuasive than anger when the evidence is strong. By early April, patches of green grass finally appeared where towering walls of snow had stood only weeks earlier. Birds returned to the trees around the workshop, and the familiar sound of melting water replaced the constant rumble of snowplows. One Saturday morning, I found myself restoring my father's old pickup truck with the garage door open, just as I had imagined when I bought the property years before. Tom wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee, looked across the open field, and laughed softly. "It is hard to believe all of this started with one pile of snow." I smiled because he was right. It had never really been about snow. It had been about respect, responsibility, and the quiet belief that nobody would notice if small boundaries were crossed often enough. They noticed in the end. Everyone did. Looking back now, I do not remember the freezing mornings nearly as much as I remember the choice I made not to let frustration dictate my actions. I could have answered carelessness with anger, but that would only have created another argument. Instead, I answered it with patience, documentation, and a willingness to let the truth reveal itself over time. The ridge disappeared with the changing season, but the lesson remained long after the last patch of ice had melted. Property lines matter. Courtesy matters. Evidence matters. And sometimes the strongest form of justice is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of decisions they believed nobody else was paying attention to.